Okay, welcome everybody to another session of basic post-processing. We're going to go ahead and jump in and get started. So the first thing that you really need for this course is a copy of the MP documentation. So I believe I sent everybody a link to download that, and just real quick, because I want to show you guys. When you download this PDF file, let's see here. Oh, this isn't the right one. It's in my MP documentation folder. The latest copy of the MP documentation has gotten pretty large. It's almost 82 megabytes. And the reason for that is that this PDF file acts like a wrapper. It's got a bunch of other PDF files inside it. So I've opened up this PDF, and here you can see you've got the intro to MP, the MP reference, NCI reference, and so on. So there's a bunch of different files that are all inside here. It's like a big folder. This is the newer MP documentation guide. And what I mean by that, this guide was rewritten for Mastercam 2017. And it used to be kind of an exercise in frustration to figure out where is the information that I need to learn about posts. What we had before was an older version of the documentation. I can go actually just show you real quick. So I want you to understand kind of the difference between the two guides. This is the older style guide. And you'll notice that there's a big difference in the size of the files. So the MP documentation used to be around 60 megabytes, and this is the older style of guide. And what I mean by older style, when you look inside it, we had what was called the MP reference guide, volumes 1, 2, and 3. And those were written for version 9. Not X9, but V9, so I guess going on 20 years ago now. And then we had some data that was kind of all of the updates that have been done since the old stuff. And it was really confusing because the layout of the guide meant that when you went to volume 1, so let me go and just open this file. When you went to volume 1 and you started reading through it, all of the information in here was written around the time of version 9. So all of the formatting had changed in the posts. A bunch of stuff had changed, and it was really kind of hard to decipher. We did get a question about the post documentation. When I sent out the original emails to you guys, and just check this real quick, there was a link to download the documentation, and I think the documentation that I have is from 2017. I don't believe I actually have the 2018 documentation, but the way that CNC Software is distributing the documentation is also changing. So it used to be they would distribute this PDF file to the resellers, and then the resellers may or may not make the documentation available to the users. So it's been kind of frustrating in some respects as someone who does training, because somebody from California can call up their reseller and boom, they've got the documentation like that. And somebody who has a different reseller might either have to pay for the documentation in some cases, or you know, the reseller just says, oh, that's not available, you know, or gives them the runaround. And so it's kind of nice that they're changing it and not nice. So what they're doing is they are So I did get a question. My reseller says it's not available yet. I did send everybody a link. Let me... Yeah. So in the Welcome to the Basic Post-Processing June 17 welcome email, there is a link down here to my Dropbox where you can download a copy of the 2017 documentation. So this is the documentation for 2017. I guarantee you the documentation for 2018 looks almost exactly the same. So the way that these documents usually work, and this is also something that's important to know. So again, here's the older version of the documentation. So let's just go through this real quick. If you happen to have an older version of the documentation, there are 3 guides, volumes 1, 2, and 3, which teach you about the MP language. So these were the original books. They are fairly big. You know, each one of these here is like, I don't know, 500 to 1,000 pages. And then volume 3 is like almost 3,000 pages. So volume 1 tells you how the MP language works. Volume 2 gives you some application guides. So how do I do things like work with subprograms or use a buffer file? And volume 3 is the language reference. It tells you what each variable name, string name, post block name is and what they do. And then in addition to this original set of documentation, for every version, Mastercam would release, or CNC software would release, the NCI and parameter reference guide for your version. So there would be, you know, an X NCI and parameter reference guide. There was one for X2, X3, X4. You can see that this one is X7. So the NCI and parameter reference for your specific Mastercam version really tells you what each NCI code does and what each parameter code does. We're going to get to that in a little bit and talk about those differences and what is a parameter, what's the difference. The NCI structure hasn't changed in 30 years. So the NCI data, well, I shouldn't say that. That's probably not quite true. But the general NCI data that you're processing is the heart of outputting code from your post processor. So normally I start this course by talking about the machine definition and then the control definition, and then we talk about the post and we do some other stuff. But I think there's a better way to start that, and it's really to get you to understand that the post processor processes NCI data. So the NCI is really the core of how the post processor works. Let's talk about why. Now, in order really to talk about why, let me make sure I keep an eye on the time here. In order to talk about why the NCI is so important, why it does what it does, we are going to jump ahead to the newer style of documentation. I think it does a better job. So let me make sure I got the right one, correct one open here. And the reason that I'm going to start with the newer documentation I think it's a lot cleaner for what they've done, and the new documentation is relevant to the formatting of the post-processor code. So one thing that's important to note before we begin, let's get some data to work with here. If I remember right, some of these toolpaths are fairly big, so I'm going to delete them so it's not quite so much stuff to work with here. Okay. So here I've got some toolpaths. And if I go to post-process them, so I've selected those operations, I'm going to post-process them. There is a new setup that started with Mastercam X. In the old days of Mastercam, all you needed was NCI data and a post-processor. The post-processor was everything. And the post-processor contained instructions that told Mastercam how to format and output your data. It's pretty simple. When version X came out, Mastercam, or CNC Software, came up with a new format, which was to link a machine definition, a control definition, and a post-processor together. And the machine and control definition live inside your Mastercam file and provide settings that influence how the post-processor outputs your data. In the documentation, get to this here. Somewhere in here, there we go. Somewhere in here is a good flow chart. So we're going to go through this here in a little bit, start going from the beginning down and just talking about the documentation, because really I can only show you so much. There is so much to learn about post-processors in general and Mastercam post-processor specifically that, you know, I would need hundreds and hundreds of hours to try and teach you everything. But the documentation does a really good job of presenting you with all the information, not necessarily teaching you how to put it all together, but at least all the information is there. So, you know, that's kind of the, I guess, the point or the benefit of the class is that, you know, we walk you through the documentation and help you interpret it. But after the class is over, you've still got the documentation. And I promise you almost every answer you're looking for is inside the documentation. Okay, I've skipped ahead a little bit in the documentation to MP processing because I think it's kind of where we want to start talking about how everything works. When I say post-processor, most people think that a post-processor is a PST file. And that's true because that's what we've come to expect when somebody says this is a post file. The PST file is an instruction list. It literally tells MPDLL how to parse your data and output the code for your machine. So when we look at how, and you know, when we talk about how MP processes data, there are two parts to the post processor. There's the part that you deal with, which is the PST file, and then there is the dynamic link library, which is MPDLL, which is what we consider the post engine. And the post engine does a lot of stuff in the background. So it is responsible for reading the operations in Mastercam. So it takes the data, it creates the NCI data from the binary data, it organizes it in a 2-line set, and then it starts reading it 2 lines at a time. Mastercam post-processing language is a scripting language. So it is designed to process NCI data in a certain way. There's a structure to the way that it works. A lot of people, when they start learning about Mastercam posts, are used to other programming languages. VB, VBScript, .NET, C++, and Mastercam posts are a little different because they are scripts. They're designed to run basically from top to bottom, but they can also jump around. There are jumps that can be made within the post, and we'll get to all that stuff. So we don't want to overwhelm you all at once, but let's talk about how MP processes the data. And actually, this is getting to be a good time to pause the video. So we did have a question I want to follow up on. Let's go ahead and pause the video, and when we come back, we'll continue to talk about how MP processes data.